Welcome to the Mercy Cast, where we are learning the art of compassion through the adversity of life. I'm your host, Raleigh Sadler. Today, I want to talk about comparison. I think that this is at the root of so many of our insecurities. We'll be thinking, well, if I was only like this, there's always a standard. The standard seems to be always outside of us. And if we see someone who just doesn't seem to be struggling with what we're struggling with, all of a sudden, we're not enough because we don't measure up. And the problem is with comparison, at least in my own life, this is an ever-evolving standard. Just when you get somewhere, it changes. There's never enough. You're never enough. And when you're living to prove yourself through this lens of comparison, you never arrive. And so for that reason, I am very excited about my guest today. My guest is Shannon Popkin. She is the author of Comparison Girl, Lessons from Jesus on Me-Free Living in a Measure Up World, and the new book, Comparison Girl for Teens, Thriving Beyond Measure in a World That Compares. Shannon, welcome to the Mercy Cast.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm just so excited that someone has point blank written a book on comparison. What led you to write a book on comparison?
Well, I think it's one of those things that we all kind of shrug at. We know it's, like you just mentioned, we're aware that we're comparing and we know it's negative, but I don't know that we realize how dangerous it is and that it's, we call comparison a game. I don't think it's a game. I think it's a strategy that our enemy uses against us to get us distracted, to get us depleted, to get us, to actually destroy our lives and to keep us from the beautiful good things that God has for us to do. So yeah, I think it's an important thing to think through. And I want us to be aware that there's a battle out there, the spiritual battle, and that our enemy is the one who's tempting us to compare.
And you say it's not a game, but it's a strategy, and that the enemy is out there trying to get you to look away from yourself or to look away from the truth and to buy lies. What are some practical ways that we fall into this comparison trap on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say we look away from ourselves. I kind of think comparison is actually a hyper focus on ourselves because, we may be looking side to side, but we're always thinking about ourselves as we look side to side. It's just our eyes are always turning to, how did I do? How am I, what are they thinking? What am I enough now? Like, what did I look like? How did I sound? And it's just this preoccupation with self and constantly measuring, constantly noticing myself. And there's a verse in James 4 that says, if you have bitter jealousy or selfish ambition in your heart, don't boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. So like that word demonic, I mean, that ties this thing directly to this world that we're living in and our enemy who's against us. But so in the beginning of that verse, so it says, if you have bitter jealousy, that's like looking over at what you have and wishing I had it. Or if you have selfish ambition, that's like trying to make it look like I have it all together. And all of these, they're not tied to God's wisdom. These are tied to this world system and this enemy who wants to destroy our lives. And so I think that's what makes me say, this isn't a game. This is something it's a ploy used against us. And it's meant to undermine, to distract, all of the negative things that our enemy has for us. He can just get us tied up in knots with comparing ourselves.
So would you say the first step in understanding this comparison trap is to understand this isn't a game? There is someone actively seeking your downfall.
I do.
And they're doing it through enticing you with this relentless self-absorption.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of influence, right? And so it's like, who are you listening to? And, so when I walk into a room, Raleigh, when I walk into a room where there are other women there, immediately my in the flesh, if I don't go in with a different purpose, what if I'm just neutral and walk into this room, immediately I'm looking around and I'm thinking, oh man, she looks better than me. She's more successful than me. She has more friends than me. She has a better marriage than me. Like all of these different ways I walk in and suddenly I am pulling back into myself. Like I don't want to be next to her because she makes me feel less than, or I don't want to be next to her because I feel like I'm superior to her and I don't want to, I don't want to be. So I walk into a room and I'm constantly measuring and comparing. And what it does then is it pulls me away from other people versus walking in like what I think Jesus invites us to is this me free sort of living where I'm not here for myself. I'm not worried about how I measure against you. I'm just here to serve you with my life, to be available to you. And comparison holds me back from all of those things.
How do you make that shift?
Right. Well, if I could just kind of go back and talk a little bit about Jesus and how he responded to comparison, I think he gives us some ideas on how to make this shift, how to go from like being completely focused on myself to being free to focus on other people and not measure. Yeah. So Jesus, when he walked the face of this earth, he met people who were comparing themselves just like we do. He was constantly having conversations and sharing stories and with people who were comparing. So remember the disciples were constantly asking, who's the greatest? Who's the greatest? Like trying to elbow past each other. The Pharisees were always feeling superior to everyone and looking down on the rest. The sinners and the sick people, the marginalized, they all felt less than. And consistently, Jesus would respond to them and he would talk about his kingdom, which I think is so interesting. You know, like, okay, so people are comparing, they're hyper focused on themselves. There's this, and Jesus of all people knows that there's an enemy who's after all of his sheep. And so he starts talking about his kingdom. Okay. So there's something in this kingdom that he's inviting us to. It's like a fork in the road. It's a different path. And so what is it about his kingdom? Sometimes I like to compare it to like a game of Uno. Raleigh, if you and I are playing Uno and you notice that I'm like trying to fill my hand with cards, and every time there's a draw four, I'm like, yes, more cards for me. If you're a good friend to me, you're going to say, okay, Shannon, do you know that the goal of Uno is not to have more cards, it's to have less? And I think that's what Jesus is doing when he talks about his kingdom. He's like, every time he talks about his kingdom, he's like, it's upside down. It's different. I know that in this world, things stack up in a particular way. And there's always this temptation to get ahead, to prove that you have more, that you are more, or to feel depressed or less than when you can't measure up. But in my kingdom, it is not like that. In my kingdom, it's completely the opposite of that. And so Jesus had these pithy little statements of whoever's the greatest is the servant. Whoever puts himself last, well, they're first in my kingdom. Whoever humbles himself, they're the exalted one in my kingdom. So it's like the rules are different there. The way to be successful in the kingdom is completely the opposite of how it works here in the world. And Jesus wants us to know that. And so he talked a lot about it. He shared stories, and that's really what I found intriguing and why I wanted to talk more about comparison, because I think Jesus is giving us the secret. The secret is we're not of this world. Those of us who believe in Jesus and who have been saved from our sins by him, we're free of this world and its mindset, and we're part of another kingdom, and things work differently in that kingdom.
You know, it's funny. I think for years, especially when I was training for ministry and I was in seminary and all that, I remember, I believe I was a Christian, but I didn't really have a healthy understanding of the gospel.
Mm.
And I remember just struggling to even minister to other people because I just felt like God loved me, but he didn't like me.
Yeah.
And I would compare myself to all these other Christians who seemed to get it. They seemed to be like, they would just walk into a room and they're beaming and they didn't seem to be struggling. And I just remember thinking through the gospel, and I had to write a paper on justification by faith. And it hit me that like, I'm not justified because of my faith. I'm justified by it. I'm
Yeah.
not made right with God because I worked something out or worked something up, or because I checked all the boxes like all the other people and finally looked the part. I'm loved by God because he loves graciously and he
Mm.
loves broken people. And in that moment, when I realized that Jesus lived for me, he died for me, and he rose for me, even when I was ungodly, even when I couldn't do it for myself,
Yeah.
when I couldn't save myself or save anyone else, he saves me. It was at that moment where I realized it freed me from this ever encroaching self absorption to all of a sudden my eyes were open to his love for me, but my eyes were also open to my neighbor. And so for the
Yeah.
first time, I had a little energy to focus on other people and to see other people. And it was like the
Mm.
gospel freed me from focusing on myself to a very unhealthy extent.
Yeah. That's so good. I am thinking of the time when Jesus's disciples were arguing about, who's the greatest. And he said to them, unless you become like this little child in the room, and he takes this baby, the smallest person in the room, and he puts him in the middle of the disciples. And he's like, unless you become like the baby, you're not even going to enter the kingdom of God. So he's talking about, how do you even get in? And it's not by being the super person. It's like you get in as a baby. A baby is the recipient. A baby is not the contributor. The baby is the one who can't do anything for himself or anybody else. That's how you enter, but that's what really gives you the freedom, because you're the recipient first. And that's not to say that you're not the contributor once you're part of this kingdom, but you're not it's like your contributions. That's not the way that you get in. And that's not how you become great. You are dependent on the one, like you were just saying, Raleigh. Jesus was great on our behalf. He
Right.
lived on our behalf. He was the
That's right.
righteous one. He was the one who paid the price and did everything for us. Like, we have to see us, like, that's square one, is seeing ourselves as the recipient of this kingdom. It's given to us. It's not earned by us. And then those who are in the kingdom, though, I think it's so interesting that we think about sin and talk about sin more than anybody else, right? I mean, because we have the Bible. We know what God thinks about sin and everything. But we, once we're in this kingdom, we kind of think of ourselves as superior. It's like, wait, did you forget something?
That's right.
And in my book, Comparison Girl, one of the chapters is on comparing sin. And it's like, just because of the way that the book was arranged, the way we wanted to put the chapters together, it kind of had to go as the first chapter after the introductory one. And I was like, I don't think people are going to want to read that. I don't think they
Yeah.
want to know about comparing sin. I think they want to talk about comparing wealth or comparing status or comparing appearances. Like, those are the things. And yet it's so interesting whenever I poll people and say, here are the different things. Here are the different ways that people in the Bible were comparing. Which one do you most want to hear about? Consistently, it's this thing of comparing sin, because we're so hurt by those who have looked down their noses at us. We're so hurt by those who have excluded us because of our sin. And what we really want to hear from is our Jesus, who says that it's not our sinlessness that makes us great. It's his sinlessness that even is even our entrance into this kingdom.
And that is something that I'd like to sit with, because that is so true. Oftentimes in our own Christian walks, we talk about, I'm struggling with sin right now, which generally means that we're like knee deep in it. It's not like we're struggling it and like battling it. It's more like that's what we say.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we're probably not struggling with it. We're probably actually doing really great at the sin. But I love this idea of, like, we'll say, well, I just want some victory. I need my victory. And we make our lives contingent upon our own experience of victory rather than resting in Christ's victory for us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think when it flows downhill from the cross, well, the gospel goes to all the darkest places. And if we say, it's not even about my victory's not enough. It's Jesus's victory for me. And that's what my hope is in. I think when we do that, that's what changes us. And I love, in your book, you talk about shifting from a me focus to a me free life.
Mm-hmm.
Describe that shift.
Well, let's just stay in the lane of comparing sin for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus tells this story about the Pharisee and the tax collector who go into the temple. And the Pharisee, all the people listening to Jesus' story, they're thinking of him as the good guy and the tax collector as the bad guy. The truth is they're both bad guys. Only one of them knows it, though. And the Pharisee gets in the temple and he starts praying really loudly so that all of the people, they would have times in their temples where it was time for public prayer, corporate prayer. And so picture the temple filled with people, and the Pharisee is praying loudly so that everybody can hear. And he's listing out, here are all the ways that he is superior. God, I thank you that I'm these ways. And I thank you that I'm not like that guy over there, the tax collector who's kind of far off. And so he sees himself as lifted up because of all the things he's done. And look at the self-focus there. Look at how he is completely focused on himself. He's elevating himself because of the ways that he has not sinned. And yet in this moment, he is sinning in a way that is very offensive to God. Whereas the tax collector, all that we know that he says in that temple, what Jesus tells us is that he says, God, forgive me, the sinner. Forgive me. He only sees himself, and he can't even lift his head. He just sees his own sin. He's not looking around and comparing. And so there's like this me-free thing of just noticing, like, I'm the sinner. I need a savior. And the surprise of the story is he's the one who goes home justified, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's the one who is forgiven. He's the one who gets to enter the kingdom of God. And the Pharisee has it all wrong. His pride and his self-focus is what he's all tied up in this world's way of measuring up, which is all about self. It's all about what I can contribute and how I can lift myself up. And so, like I said earlier, Jesus's kingdom is it's opposite. It's different from that. Even like we've said, the first way that you enter is knowing what Jesus has done. But then the way I like to think about it, Raleigh, if we're going to shift our mindset from a me focus to a me free, I like to use the illustration of a measuring cup, like the glass kind with the lines on the side of the cup. And picture your life as like this measuring cup, and everything in the cup they're all gifts from God. Everything that makes you, your gifts, your talents, your relationships, what you look like, where you've come from, it's all mingled in this cup. And what we're tempted to do is take our cup and constantly be putting it next to somebody else's and focus on those red lines. Like, how do I measure up? How am I doing? Try posture, make it look like I have more in my cup than I do. Lie, so that I look better than I actually am. But what Jesus points us to is the spout. And that's really what Jesus did with his life. Jesus, if he had a measuring cup, it'd be the biggest one. It'd be like bigger than the universe, right? And it'd be completely brimming full. Jesus had no lack. And yet, what did he do with his full measuring cup? Philippians 2 says that we're to have the mind of Jesus, who did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. That's a measuring word, right? Jesus, he was equal to God, but that's not what he came to prove here on his earth. He didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself. He made himself a servant. He poured his life out, first by even becoming a human, right? Taking the form of a human being. But then on the cross, he emptied himself for us, right? He lifted us up. Like, that is crazy. And so the shift that happens when we leave the world's mindset and adopt Jesus's mindset is we start to do what he did. Like, we take whatever we have been gifted from the Father and we tip that measuring cup and we look for ways to pour ourselves out, right? To empty ourselves and to lift others up. And the beautiful thing about that metaphor is when you take the cup and you tip it, the lines don't matter anymore. And so there's this freedom that comes, freedom from self-focus when I start looking at you. When I go, Raleigh, to go fill you up with whatever's in my measuring cup, I'm not focused on the lines. I'm not focused on myself. I'm looking at the spout and I'm trying to point it in your direction. I'm thinking of you. And there is such freedom that comes from that.
Yeah, because now you're not honestly trying to save yourself anymore.
Exactly.
And I think so much of life can become a functional savior. Like, am I attractive enough? Am I funny enough? Am I a good enough speaker? Is my book going to sell enough? Whatever you're doing, you start adding that word enough, and then if you catch yourself, you can realize, okay, I need this to feel good. I need this to feel like I am enough. And I think that insecurity, whether we're self-aware or not, is evidence of something deeper. But when we no longer have anything to prove, when we realize that Christ, through his vicarious life and death on our behalf, he proved everything that we couldn't. When we get rooted to that idea, or when that idea just changes us, then all of a sudden it's like, okay, yeah, I can laugh at myself now. There have been times in my life where, because I grew up as a perfectionist, and as a perfectionist, there are moments, maybe one or two, where you do compare yourself with other people. And you hope and pray that you can be perfect, but you can't, because you think if you're perfect, you'll be loved. And I think when you do that, all your energy goes into proving that. And if someone makes fun of you or something doesn't go your way, it's like your skin is being ripped from you.
Yeah. That's when you find out that you've been too worried about, am I enough? Is when it's obvious that you aren't enough, right? And yet you've never been enough. And that wasn't what was asked of you, right? In the first place. But I just think it's so interesting to think about how Jesus would influence us versus the world would influence us. And, the freedom that comes from listening. So you're talking about perfectionism. I struggle with that too. And with the books and with I set out to tip my measuring cup and empty and offer, but then I get back to measuring okay, how is my service before the Lord measured? And that's ridiculous. And yet we fall right back into the same trap, even in the church, even those who are serving the Lord in particular ways, we exhaust ourselves again, trying to measure up. And so I think it's important that we pay attention to the messaging that we're listening to. So if you or me or somebody who's listening to the podcast today is thinking has some messaging that goes you're never going to measure up. Look at you. You're such a failure. You can't do it. You didn't do it. You won't do it. Or, you've screwed up your marriage. You've screwed up your kids. You have let go of every opportunity. You're such a failure. Stop for a moment when that messaging comes at you and just ask yourself, is that the way that Jesus talks to me? Is that, just read through the Gospels. I've got one of those Bibles that Jesus's words are in red. And do we ever find him saying any such thing to any person? Look at you. You're ridiculous. You don't measure up. You're never going to be enough. No, Jesus has never said anything remotely like that. Jesus, look at his words that we have in the gospel. He tells us that the humble one is exalted in the kingdom. The humble one, the one who serves other people, that's who is celebrated in the kingdom. And also pay attention to that. Do you ever hear the enemy saying anything remotely like that? No, that's not the messaging of this world of serve somebody, lift others up. You're free to do that. You don't have to prove yourself. You're just free to give what you already received.
And I think a danger that a lot of us in Christendom face is many of us have made self-loathing a virtue. We baptize it and basically say, "No, I'm humble. This is humility." When it's actually it's a prideful act. You are focusing on yourself, and when in those moments, self-loathing is that moment where you do fail or you just don't do something perfectly, and then you say, "You idiot! You always screw up," and then you're speaking to yourself in a way that Jesus does not speak to you. The Holy Spirit does not speak to you like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, Jesus in John 10, he talks about how the guy who's climbing over the sheep pen, that is not the shepherd. That's the enemy who sneaks in and he gets among the sheep and he wants to kill the sheep. But the point is, your enemy is sneaky. He does not come to the front door and ring the doorbell, ding dong, I am here to deceive you and lead you astray. No, he sneaks into our thoughts with like you're saying, these nuanced self-loathing or self-depreciating, where the shepherd doesn't talk to us that way. The shepherd, in that passage, Jesus says, "My sheep know my voice." He's very clear about who he is and where he's leading us. And he calls us by name. There's a relationship. There's nothing nuanced about our relationship with Jesus. When we're following Jesus, we know we're following Jesus. When we're following the enemy, sometimes we're not even aware that we're following the enemy. That text says that the sheep, they're not, he's like a stranger to them, like a voice that it's like a stranger's voice you can't recognize. And it says that the sheep, they won't listen to a stranger. I think of it like an arsonist who sets a fire. The studies have shown that arsonists like to burn things down, but they also like to come back and see the destruction. And so in the photos after a fire, you can often find the arsonist right there in the crowd. And they're not naming themselves. They're fine with nobody knowing that it was them, but they experience this sense of power and importance as they watch the destruction. And that's how our enemy is. He doesn't need to be named by us. He doesn't need us to be aware that he's the one who's burning our lives down with this shame and self-loathing, right? He's destroying us, but he's just like in the crowd watching with this sense of power and significance as our life is burning down. But see, Jesus isn't like that. Jesus is very clear. He says, come follow me, give up your life. Yeah. Like, I'm not going to tell you to lift yourself up. That's not Jesus's way, but he's very clear. And we know if we're following Jesus and listening to his words, we know we're following Jesus. You never follow Jesus by accident.
Right. No, and Shannon, Jesus comes to us in a soft manner. A bruised reed he will not break. He says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest.
Yeah.
And I think as those of us who have grown up in a measure up culture, oftentimes we just think that this is normal. We think that, I can be my worst critic and I can be hard on myself and yada, yada, yada. But we're basically living by the law, not by grace in that moment. And so it's like, you've been talking about this idea of, yes, the measure up mindset is not the way that your life was intended to be. And so rather than taking your eyes, or rather than looking just at you and then others, let's look outside of ourselves. Let's look to Jesus. And how does our confidence kind of flow from that? Because this is interesting, because this goes against everything that we know naturally. Like, we're not the solution. So the solution must be outside of ourselves. How does confidence and freedom flow from that external place?
Yep. So what I like to say is the servant is just, they're serving. The servant doesn't have to be seen, but the servant doesn't mind being seen either. And so it gives us this freedom. If we're simply there to serve, if we're not trying to earn anything with the way that we serve the world, with whoever we are, whatever we have in our measuring cup. And for all of us, it's different. We have different ways to serve the world, different ways to invest in people. But if we just show up as the servant, we've got our servant's towel, we're ready, we're there to invest. Sometimes we're going to have to be in the public eye to do that. So like, I just hosted a Bible study in my home this summer. And the first night I was worried about, the house isn't perfect. The lawn isn't mowed. Right. And I thought, no, I'm just going to serve. Well, afterwards, I started beating myself up because I'm like, oh man, I talk too much. I didn't ask great questions. I hope they'll still come back. Well, okay, there I am back to measuring. When I am there to serve, I am the recipient in the story. I'm the one I get to serve. I have a house. God gave me this house. I'm the recipient. I've received this house from the Lord, and I just open the door and share it with other people. I can read. So we're reading a book together. So I am able to read, and I have thought through some things, and I'm just there too. And it's okay that I'm seen as a leader, because that's sometimes people serve by leading, but I'm not there to win approval. I'm not there to not be rejected or to earn for myself some sort of status as like, I am the leader of the Bible study. Like, no, it's not about that. I'm simply there to serve. And that's just the freedom. That's this me free freedom. But the moment that I retract all of that and get back to measuring and shaming myself or looking down on other people, that's another way that we compare. I've let go of the mindset, this me-free mindset of Jesus's kingdom.
No, that is helpful, because operating as a servant kind of strips you of everything, because it's no longer about you. You're just saying, I've heard the old phrase, it's just one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread.
Yeah.
And I think that strips us from the comparison trap. But it also is a fantastic way of influencing people because now, like every one of us, you're kind of raised with this idea of you got to be the biggest and the best. But what if our ministry is small? What if
Exactly.
we have a ministry where we're only interacting in a small group setting? That's okay. What if it's just
Yeah.
one-on-one? That is okay because people's worlds are being changed as your world is being changed through Jesus. And
Yeah.
so it becomes hyper relational. It's less about you proving yourself and more just resting in who God is for you.
Yeah.
And what I think is interesting, it's as you're talking about that, you're talking about how your influence is flowing from a place of being a servant. And I think that flies in the face of what we're seeing on social media, whether it's Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. There are influencers out there who are telling us how to live our lives, and they're fueling this comparison trap.
It's so true. Yeah. The interesting thing about it, Raleigh, is that God did not put equal amounts in our measuring cups. Like we are different. And you know what? Jesus isn't afraid to notice that. I think that's intriguing also. Like when he told the parable of the talents, he could have told that story in a simpler way. He could have said that there
Right.
were, two guys who both had 3 talents, one buried it and one didn't. Right. But instead, he tells it in this interesting way where the different servants received different amounts. So one gets 5, one gets 2, one gets 1. And the guy with 1 buries it. But the other 2, like what's intriguing about that parable is it says that the master gave to each according to their capacity. And so the master knew how much they could carry, how much they could handle, and he gave to them accordingly. And so look at the freedom in that. Like our God knows that some of us have a higher capacity level than others. Some of us can't handle the sort of responsibility that the person next to us can. And he's okay with that. And what my favorite part of that parable is that in response to the guy who had 5 and doubled it, the master says, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with much or faithful with little. I'll set you over much. Enter into your master's happiness." But then with the guy who has 2, it's exactly the same. He's doubled it and has 4. And the master says exactly the same thing to him. "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into your master's happiness." And so like what that shows me is our rewards aren't tied to results. Like our rewards are just our master knows our capacity level. He's entrusted a certain amount to us. And all he asks is that we be good and faithful servants, not good and productive, not good and prosperous, whatever, good and faithful servants. And all of us, no matter what's in our measuring cup, we all have the potential to do just that.
Good and faithful servants. We can all do that. And Shannon, when you think like that, you take away that measuring stick. Now you're like, a life well lived could be a life where maybe I'm only connecting with a few people.
Right.
Or it could be I'm on the front page news for positive things.
Yeah.
I've got a massive following.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think there's a freedom there. And for me, it's no longer this idea of if I got that, then I would be happy. It's more of a, man, if I could just have enough.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about it. But there was a period of my life where I was like, no, I want people to know me. Because I felt like if that happened, then I would finally be enough. And then you realize that it's never enough. You feel like the author of Ecclesiastes, you're like,
Yeah.
I've done all the things and I never found the thing I was looking for.
It's just wind. Yeah.
And,
yeah.
and I think so much of trying to understand comparison is just to continue to live, make mistakes, and realize there's a pattern here.
Mm-hmm.
There's a pattern of results that keep happening. Comparison offers me freedom and it gives me slavery.
Mm.
And so the only way out is...
It's never going to be enough, right?
No.
Yeah, exactly. But in the kingdom, there is like this freedom available to us. And I love that you said, like, it kind of brings us together to recognize, maybe I'm a 2-talent person and my friend here is a 5-talent person.
Yeah.
And God knows that. And God knows that he can be entrusted with more and I can't. And God's okay with that. Can I be okay with that? And then it allows me to turn to this person and just say, like, I hope you'll be faithful. Like, I hope you'll be faithful with what you've been entrusted in. I'm just trying to be faithful over here. If I'm freed from the results, if my rewards aren't tied to results, I can just stay in my own lane. I can just take whatever amount of talent that God has given me and invest it and be faithful. And, tip my measuring cup, pour out what I've been given, not what you've been given, but what I've been given.
And that freedom actually breeds creativity, because now
it does.
The pressure's off. Now you have this grace-fueled life to where you're like, I'm going to take a risk today. I'm going to try this. And then you may find your calling. People will connect with it because we all want freedom.
Yeah. Yeah. Look at how that brings you back to being the recipient, creativity. You're such a recipient as the creative one. You start with a blank piece of paper and you don't have anything, and God backlogs that and fills. But if you're stuck in that, I've got to produce, I have to measure up, I have to, like, it just holds you back. And I think there are many people, many books that haven't been written, many skills that haven't even been, scratched the surface of the potential, because we're so tied to the results and looking side to side and afraid of, what if I don't, what if I fail, what if I don't measure up? I have a podcast, Raleigh, and I remember studying the parable of the talents and praying through that and asking God, like, okay, I know I'm probably not a 5-talent person. I know I'm not a 1-talent person, because I haven't buried what you've given me. I know that for sure. And I'm probably like a 2, but is there anything that I've buried? I was pretty sure he was going to say no. And God brought to mind, as I was praying, he brought to mind this conversation I had with a bunch of influencer women. And I had thought about asking them, hey, would you have any advice for hosting a podcast? But then when I got in the room and I heard the numbers of, like, how many people they were reaching, I just thought, oh my word, let them do the podcasting. I don't need to. The world does not need another podcast, right? And so as I'm praying through the parable of the talents, like, Lord, I haven't buried anything, right? I got a text message from that group of influencers. And the Lord brought that conversation back to mind. And I thought, oh, okay. Let me just say, I should not have had my phone with me during prayer, but it brought that back to mind. And as I went to the Lord and, okay, where were we? I'm not the 1-talent. And then my eyes flew open and I thought, Lord, have I buried this idea of a podcast? Simply because I wouldn't have a podcast that would reach millions or reach even thousands. Have I buried that? Are you asking me to be the 2-talent guy who doesn't have as much capacity, but has a little and should invest? And I thought, man, I've got to really sit with that and pray with that. And that was really what prompted me to start a podcast. It was like the freedom of the numbers. I don't have to prove anything. I don't have to measure up. I'm not worried about the reach. I'm just concerning myself with, can I be faithful with what I've been entrusted?
Yeah, I remember when I wrote my first book, and then even when I was going to do the podcast, the same pushback comes each time you try to create something new, because it's almost like people can become gatekeepers. Maybe it's for your good. Maybe it's because they're nervous. I don't know. But oftentimes people will say, well, there's already a million podcasts and there's already a million books. And I think both of those statements are 100% true.
It's true.
But I also think people are going to gravitate towards what interests them and what connects with them. And not everything that's out there is going to connect. And so don't bury your talent, because there may be 100 people who are going to listen to your podcast.
That's right.
And that's more than the average church. And so these are 100 people that choose to listen to you every single week.
Yeah.
That's kind of incredible.
Yeah.
And you get to influence and encourage people. And if God decides to grow that, great. And if he doesn't, it's okay, because lives are being changed. People are being challenged, and you're leaving the world a little bit better than you found it. And I think that is such a good place to be, especially when we want to compare ourselves with everyone else. We can say, okay, it's not my job to save the world, and it's not my job to save myself.
Yep.
It's God's job to do both.
Mm-hmm. And he actually already has done it.
100%.
Yep. But I just get to be the faithful servant. who's been entrusted with something for a time. It's not going to be forever. My life will come to an end. And the goal is to hear, well done, good and faithful servant.
Shannon, that note is a perfect one to end on. In these last moments, how would you encourage those of us who, whether it's what we see on TV, whether it's what we see online, whether it's what we look at when we're just mindlessly scrolling on our phones, how do we avoid comparing ourselves with others?
Well, I think the key is to not just be mindless about it, right? Just to know that you have an enemy who's going to be bombarding you with all of this influence. And how can you be influenced by your Lord Jesus, the one who emptied himself on your behalf? How can you be listening for his voice? How can you remind yourself what his kingdom is like, where the great one is the servant, the one who humbles himself, is like Jesus is given the name that is above all name because of his extravagant humility. So how can I be humble? How can I enter every single room with my measuring cup tipped, asking, how can I serve somebody here today? That's where the freedom comes from. But that's also where the worthy life of the servant is set also.
Thank you so much. I think that's a reminder that we all need today. So thanks for being on.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.